Yeah.
Oh, and Andre is on now too.
All right. And Kate's going to manage the chat for me because something strange happens with my mouse when I share my PowerPoint. So we'll see what happens here again. And my house, it is an absolute beautiful day in Pennsylvania, but I'm freezing. So I did a wardrobe change and added a fuzzy jacket.
Me too. It's freezing.
It's stunningly beautiful.
You're always cold, Kate.
Good point.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I'm going to share my PowerPoint. We're going to talk about a welcoming environment. And this is, all right, can you see that?
Yes,
Can you all see? Okay, great. Okay, so this session was developed for our teaching and learning students. So we're primarily talking about a welcoming environment within the classroom. But that obviously has a factor or impact for our K through 12 educators, as well as our higher ed administrators. We can talk about the environment of the campus, the environment of your school district, or again, be creative in how we approach this session. And my faculty colleagues, please feel free to jump in at any point if there's something you'd like to add related to this really important topic. And I think some of the things we talked about from the philosophical perspective of the policy conversation, I think fit very well here in how we do this work. So we're going to talk about how we define a welcoming environment. And I have the student interest questionnaire on here because it's something I do in person. We're going to talk about the tools we use that help us to create that welcoming environment. What do first impressions mean to our students? How do we set the tone? And what are some of our strategies for success? And for the students in EDU 860, this is based on 2 chapters in 2 of our textbooks, How Learning Works and Teaching at Its Best. So I'll ask for Lynn and Sarah to jump in on any places where the text has actually impacted their work. So what is a welcoming environment? So let's start with that question. If there's some volunteers out there that could share, when you saw this topic on the schedule, what did you think about?
I thought about an inviting environment where not only do you welcome them, but you're inviting them in to be part of whatever community you have.
I think about, I'm sorry.
Well, actually, I'm going to just ask if you will, so I know your names pop up when you speak sometimes, but just for everyone to get to know a little bit about you, if you'd share what environment you are working in education right now. So I think that was that Ginny?
Yes, it's Ginny. I'm a K through 5 environment.
Okay, great. Thank you. Go ahead.
My name's Brian. I'm in elementary school K to 4 principal. I've been thinking a lot about like my approach to education now as opposed to 6 years ago. 6 years ago, I was pushing paper. Today, I'm more focused on building relationships. And I don't know if it's because I'm in a higher performing school, so that there's less of a need to push the paper, or if I've just kind of grown as a father and as an educator in the last 6 years.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Anybody else want to add what a welcoming environment means to them? I think those are 2 powerful statements that I want to pull from. Go ahead, Dr. Bandler.
Yeah, I wanted just to say something about what that means in a doctoral program. I think that part of it is a feeling that I belong here and that this is a place that it should be, that I'm as bright as everybody else. I can learn, I can do the work just like everybody else can. And not everyone feels that way. Sometimes our students feel kind of a little insecure, and one of maybe the most important purpose of this weekend is for all of us to get to know each other better and come away with the feeling that, yes, this is a group of people that I like to be with, and I do belong here.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Banlow, I would add in the chat box, there's a lot of energy and a lot of people are sharing, different contexts, right? So school administrators who are creating a welcoming environment for staff and for students, but a whole lot about people being recognized and appreciated as individuals, especially when they're new to an organization. So that's just some of the key things that are in the chat box.
As a nonprofit leader, we have networking events, like we run 750 to 1,000 events a year. And we have a lot of people who are introverts. So that translates to classrooms of all ages, you know, kids to adults. So it's being there for people, making them feel comfortable and having them belong.
Great, thank you for sharing, Lynn. I think it's really, so my background, I have an undergraduate degree in journalism, and I love words. I love the newspaper. I still have the newspaper delivered to my house. And so when you were speaking, I was writing down some of the words you shared. And, you know, Ginny, when you started, you said inviting, right? So the idea you invite them in, and you said to be part of. I think that really is part of this, right? Our words are intentional, and how we build this relationship, like Brian said, is really important. And I think Dr. Banlow talked about the importance of belonging in a doctoral program, but I think any marginalized student potentially needs to feel that, whether it's in elementary school or in a doctoral program or undergrad or graduate school, or even your teachers who might have a sense of imposter syndrome. So that idea that we all belong in that environment is an important concept to address. And how do we do that? So I wanted to talk specifically about the ideal classroom environment. We all know we've been in many different types of classes. What do you think is the ideal classroom?
Safe. I'm Phil. My name's Phil Jim. My name's Phil. I think it has to be safe for learning. Like, they have to feel like there's a positive, it's very positive, and that they feel they can express themselves and take risks in a classroom.
I think on my end, it's broadening your definition of what safe means and making sure that it's aligned to the vision of your organization. Because I often think as educators, we use the word safe, welcoming, but really creating this environment where individuals can be their authentic selves and they feel comfortable enough doing that. So I think it comes with having a discussion around beliefs and what an environment should look like, so that everyone has a common understanding of what safe, authentic, and welcoming means.
So you bring up a really good point about the discussion that happens around these concepts. So what does the physical environment have to look like, or does it not matter? Does it not matter what the space looks like in order to build these different types of concepts? Or do you think it does matter?
I don't think it matters on my end.
Okay.
And I think because when we build an environment where the structure matters, sometimes it confines what authentic learning and opportunities look like.
Okay. Does anybody have, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, it's okay. I think that this all, and I'm looking in the chat as well, it all looks different depending on what type of classroom we're in. I saw somebody mention flexibility, but for me, my name's Amanda, as a first grade teacher, sometimes the physical space is important. Like, for example, one of the things I like to do to connect with my students is a morning meeting in which we all sit in a circle, but I will sit on the floor with them to show like I'm here with you to talk to you, not sitting above you in a way.
So Amanda hits a really powerful component, because one of the things that I was going to do a poll, and you know, do you teach in rows? Do you teach in circles? Do you teach at tables? All of those things really matter. And I always start, when I taught first year experience, I started every class in a circle. They were at desks. I didn't actually have them sit on the floor, which probably works better with first graders. But but sit in a circle, because all points on a circle are equal, and no one can hide in the back or hide in the or be in the front. Right? Everyone is an equal component there, and all get to be a part. But so I think when you talk about sitting on the floor with them, that is powerful symbolism.
Well,
anybody else? I feel like. Mark, go ahead.
I just want to chime in and say that that's honoring the person who comes into your classroom. You're by honoring them, you're putting them in that place where they can hear and they know they're being heard and that they're understood. And it's not just creating the environment, it's them understanding that you're there for them, they're there for each other, and that they're a learning community. And I know that's a common word, is community, but that it's shared, that they contribute. Just like we're doing here, everybody's contributing and everybody's also gaining from that process.
Absolutely. Thanks for sharing. Yeah. I had the opportunity as a faculty member to pick my classrooms, and I liked the flexible spaces and there was one classroom that the chairs were on wheels, and that probably would not work, Amanda, in the first grade classroom. But with the college students, it enabled us to do group work. It enabled us to have circles. But what I found is that if they were able to move by their wheels, they did. So even to throw something in the trash, to turn in a paper, they never got up. They rolled around the room. So there are some complications related to those logistics. But does anybody have a preferred way of setting up their room if they have the power to do so?
I teach, well, was in the classroom teaching mathematics, which everybody loves, right? So the very first thing I felt to create an environment for all the students to belong and to feel that they could take risks was to show them that they had the power to learn. I would have them in groups. I would have them in a circle. I would purposely set them up for success in their first assignment. But I would also show them that, and I always would say this, you know, I did not come out of my mother's womb doing calculus. Okay? And I had to work at it. I had to work at it. So let's look at this together. And then I purposely would make silly mistakes so that they understand that I'm not perfect and that I still make mistakes and it's okay to make mistakes. And so I tried to really get that message across early so that my students were more ready to take that risk in answering those questions. And when they answered questions, I would never say you're right or you're wrong. I depended on the entire class to have that discussion and decide, oh, that is the right answer. And I liked how you went through it. Or maybe, well, let's go back and look. Let's everybody check this so that it wasn't a black and white, even though mathematics is black and white. So I found it very difficult in that discipline to create that environment.
That's powerful, though.
Dr. Cresswell-Yaker,
sure.
There's some really great energy in the chat box right now from a lot of our people who, I think many of them who have special ed concentration in recognizing how to sort of plan for individual needs and look at the way that your classroom may be set up in a way that isn't conducive to supporting them. So there's some talk about being left-handed and having desks that all have a right return, or students who may perhaps have mobility issues or be in a wheelchair. So finding those ways as proactively as possible to know what your students need, have them be able to communicate them to you, and make sure that the physical environment is truly accessible as a learning environment for everyone.
Patrick wanted to chime in too.
Patrick, go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted the camera to go on, let people know I am here. I'm super cognizant of everyone's comfortability with it. I was just going to say, first of all, I just kudos to all of you as instructors. It's really just interesting and fun, I think, to see how messy and clean things have been. Really, it's I said this to my teachers Friday. I said everyone was nervous. I said, look, this is, for lack of a better word, I really do see this as exciting in the sense that we are fumbling in the dark in many ways, but I've never seen such collaboration amongst my faculty and such sharing of resources, really, however reactive it might be, right? But back to the environment and to the setting, I think as a kind of a philosopher and theology by background, I think I always look at things kind of symbolically, and I think we also want to be cognizant of how sometimes we engage in the bells and whistles when the psychology of pedagogy hasn't changed, right? So it's a lot of, it can be, not that it is, but it can be a lot of window dressing without a lot of real changes to the system. And I say that brief example, I remember when smart rooms were kind of coming in the classroom, right? If you had a smart board and you were doing PowerPoint, you were being cutting edge teacher, right? And the funny thing is that all the kids were still going to sleep, right? But as a supervisor, you looked at being in a smart room and having a PowerPoint and you thought you were teaching well and students were learning. And I think obviously we need to recognize that the environment needs to be conducive to the different myriad of student learning abilities. But on the other hand, you still need to talk about changing that craft and practice, right? Educators love to talk about how long they've been teaching for. But the problem is if you've been doing the same thing for 20, 30 years, that's not really growth or innovation either, right? We would gasp at doctors if they said, right, here's the prescription I've always given to my patients for the last 30 years, try it. Or if lawyers were still using on case law from the 1960s, right? But in education, I think there's a lot of that new bells and whistles sometimes that can obfuscate what is or isn't really happening in the classroom. So.
Sure. Well, and I think, Patrick, you make a really good point about how we often teach the way we were taught. And so that is a challenge for us too. And especially in higher ed, I think it's really interesting to think about the fact that K through 12 teachers are taught how to teach, but faculty members in a college are taught their discipline, not how to manage their classroom, not how to create a welcoming environment. So I often go to our education faculty or to colleagues that are educators to say, this is not something I learned specifically this way. We need to build those resources. So again, often, and Sarah and I have had some conversations related in the ED 860 course about her faculty development of the instructors going online now in this sort of messy time, and how we often, if we're a lecturer, we just try to lecture through the microphone and camera. If you are more comfortable in how you were taught, that's probably the impact you're given. So thank you for sharing that. Anybody else have a comment on?
Yes. I would like to piggyback on what Patrick was saying. Because my building is going through a demographic change for the most part, and we're seeing more kids coming in with innate behaviors and these ACEs, we've had to actually change the environment, our instructional environment, in that this past year we've done after school trainings. Well, I have with my staff, we've done a book study on supporting behavior for school success through the CI3T.org organization, in that we're looking to make these children who are coming in who may present with ADHD, who may not, it may be anxiety or trauma. We're looking at different opportunities for them to respond. We're changing the environment of the classroom so that we're looking at pre-corrections, just giving them every possible advantage to be successful and not meet with, no, stop doing that, no, you can't do that, and just really giving them an opportunity to be who they are and then kind of rewire where they need to be to kind of function in a class of 25 to 28.
Yeah, thank you, Donna. That's powerful work. It's hard work, right? That's not easy.
Yeah.
Go ahead. I don't know.
One thing I was going to mention is when we have a disconnect between what we're saying in terms of what we're doing in the classroom in setting up that welcoming environment, and yet what we're actually saying. So for example, we just had our situation when we brought our faculty back into school to prepare for our online learning. And so we had this huge faculty meeting between two schools, and our district asked us to bring our staff together. And we had the very first slide up that they had given us that said, hey, we're gonna practice these 3 hygiene things. We're gonna, have hand sanitizer when you come in and when you leave. We're gonna, do the fist bump instead of handshaking, and then we're gonna have social distancing. Well, we had 100 people in the library. And so everybody immediately just kind of laughs that here we say we're practicing social distancing, and yet we've created an environment that actually didn't support what we said we're gonna do. I've had teachers adopt flexible seating in the classroom and kind of a 21st century model, and yet it's not flexible when students can't choose those seats, but when they're assigned or when they're only allowed to be used during certain times. So we have to make sure that our messaging and what we're allowing is consistent with what we've set up. And when there's a disconnect, it's not a welcoming environment anymore. It might look like it, but there's a disconnect between our messaging and the actual product that we're giving someone.
Great. That's really important information to be thinking about, because we do have the power to fix that, right? The administration at your institution had the power to actually practice social distancing, but it would have needed probably a little more work to figure out how to get those 100 people that information. Okay, so just to take a look at some of the elements of a welcoming environment, and I certainly want anyone to reach out as you like to, and then Kate will also see what's happening in the chat. I see there's lots of things flying through there, but to start out with inclusive language. So one of the things that I think is an important component of this is our forms and our paperwork, our policy books, our handbooks, our communications to our campus community. So does anybody have any comments related to inclusive language, related to our language, our forms, our information?
Can I jump in?
Please.
So
I'm sorry, Sarah. I just want to share that when my son started first grade and my partner and I went to back to school night, like I applauded the teacher for scratching out the term mother and adding father. I just didn't feel like I want to teach my kids to advocate for themselves. So I kind of made my concerns known, had a meeting with the principal, went as high as the superintendent, just because I felt like it wasn't representative of the community. I wasn't the only family out there that had concerns in regard to this. Ironically, within 6 or 7 months, the district changed all of their forms and replaced all the terms with Guardian 1 and Guardian 2. I got a personal email from the director of special education, who was the one who helped make their forms more inclusive. She thanked me for her concern, said she was working on it, kept me posted during the whole process. Interestingly, I was sharing this with another two-mother family, and they shared that the special education supervisor was also in a same-sex partnership with her partner, and they had 2 kids in the district as well. So I thought it was very interesting that I didn't know how that impacted her personally, and how she was probably thankful that I expressed the concern.
Thank you for sharing that. Those are powerful examples. Sarah, did you have a comment?
Yeah, so this is a really large concern on our campus. Again, I'm in Wyoming, which for better or for worse is a very, very conservative place. Many of you have probably not experienced a place so conservative. I work with a lot of students who we have to be very careful not to out. And so I think subtlety in messaging is important. I include a pronoun line in my email signature, which has, I really didn't think it was a huge deal, and it's made a big impression. And it's a really subtle message to students who may not be comfortable saying this is what I need, but they know that I'm a safe place. We're also working on, and this is low-hanging fruit, but I oversee our DEI work at the institution, and we're working on a static cling for windows that just says you belong here. Again, I think we have to change our forms. We have to be progressive, but in a place where I face a lot of pushback, we can still do work to send subtle messages to those students who need us to help them figure out what works for them.
Thank you. Yes. Anybody else want to talk about language and inclusive language in the classroom or within our syllabi?
Well, I certainly use it in my teaching. I try to make sure that the examples I use aren't just Billy and Susie, and that when I'm using examples, I've taught a lot of research classes, and so I say, you know, when you're collecting gender on data, I don't just say male, female, I provide other options as well, and just having open conversations about those types of things. So I'm trying to be thoughtful about that, represent international populations in my examples, represent different religious perspectives in my examples, not because we're talking about that religion or we're talking about nationality, but it's that subtle message comes through that this is inclusive and everybody is represented here.
Great, thank you. Does anyone have any strategies they want to share for how to be more inclusive in their language? Things that have worked or ideas that you have?
We've done a lot of training in my organization around unconscious bias, implicit bias, and language that we use with students. So we've trained our staff on how to ask the questions that they're uncertain about, but also how their own personal beliefs may impact what they say in their classrooms. So our first training was really around our LGBTQ community and helping teachers understand that the language that you use could be offensive, whether it's to a parent or to a student. So we actually created statements and possible microaggressions that could happen that teachers wouldn't be aware of. And they had to kind of list things that they had questions about, and almost similar to what we did with students, kind of sentence frames to address certain issues. So we've done that 3 to 4 times because after our first situation, we realized that it was something that had to be addressed 2 to 3 times a year with teachers just as a refresher.
Oh, that's great. That's really a commitment, right? 2 to 3 times a year allows for dialogue to continue to happen throughout the course of the academic climate. Kate, anything you want to add? I see the chat is popping up over here.
Yeah, it is. There's a lot of dialogue about operating in a, I think Sarah, it was Sarah's comments about operating in a conservative environment really resonated with a lot of and certainly a lot of discussion around LGBTQ. I don't think anyone specifically mentioned gender pronouns, but certainly I think that's, that's a piece of it. And someone mentioned that, you find those folks that are really skilled, whether it's your Gay Straight Alliance advisor or someone else in the organization who has their thumb on the pulse of that and can provide support for you as an instructor or a leader in guiding your way through that.
Well, and I think it's important to share. I was looking at a checklist for welcoming LGBT and gender inclusive students to your classroom environment. And you can find those resources on the web. But as students are sharing, if there are resources you can share with each other, I think that can be really powerful so that we can build that repository of work. So
Tiffany, could I add just one piece to that?
Sure.
I want to see if this will work very well. It probably does not. This is Ron Ferguson. And Ron is a professor of economics at Harvard Kennedy School. Ron has been dragged into the achievement gap research over the last few years, and it's very, very, very strong research, very, very useful research about achievement gap. And Ron maintains that one of the most important factors in urban or low-income students succeeding, I should say low income rather than just urban, is knowing that their teachers care about them. And he defines caring in a very precise way as something that students would know that you are not there just for a paycheck, where you expect a lot from them, where you won't let them fail, where you clearly go above and beyond the requirements of your job. And Ron makes the point that for affluent students are able to survive having teachers who are not caring, who don't exhibit caring, because they have so many other supports. But for urban students, that when they perceive that a teacher really doesn't care, they tune them out, turn them off. They're only hurting themselves by doing that, but nonetheless, that is the way that they will react. And so we've done, when I was superintendent in Hillside, I brought Ron in to do some professional development with our faculty. And it was very well received because they understood very well that and the research base that supports what you're talking about with elements of a welcoming environment applies to the school as a whole. It applies to the individual classroom. It applies to every interaction between a professional at the school and a student or a parent, either one. And that how critical this is to their success, much more so than in the case of suburban kids or affluent kids that may have other supports. So I think this is that we really need to emphasize how critically important this topic is and this approach at any level. And I think that even though Ron's research happens to be at the K to 12 level, I think you can absolutely make this case at the undergrad level as well.
Absolutely. I think it carries even to, I know Lynn has shared with us that she doesn't work in higher education, she works in nonprofit, and I think it makes sense in really all of our environments. And in the sake of time, I'm going to jump, because a lot of these things I think can build upon sort of global concepts and ideas, but the idea of building community, and I think someone mentioned that, I think Mark, you said community and talked sort of about the sort of generality of the word, but I think it's important to really look at the symbolic nature of that word. How do we build community? So some of the suggestions that I have read that I thought were interesting were arrive early. Be in your class, know all of your students' names. Now, for a K through 12 instructor, that may not seem surprising, but in higher ed, it's not always the case where your faculty actually knows who you are, knows your name. And knowing information about them is really important as well. Any comments related to building community that you and your experience, something that's worked, a strategy or a challenge that you faced? Or Kate, anything in the chat? I know we're up to 150 messages over there.
There's just, oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Sarah.
I was just going to jump in and say, when I saw what you had about getting to know students' names and building community, one of the things that I started doing a few years ago, because we have all students' pictures in our PowerSchool portal, we can see our class list. I study their pictures before they get there on the first day of school, so I don't have to fumble through learning their names. My goal is to get every name correct by the time they walk in my door that very first time. And even understanding little differences about them. I think my class this year, I have fraternal twins, and the parent said I was the first teacher to point out that they actually are fraternal and not identical, because I studied their pictures. And when I met the parents, I could see this child looked more like dad and this child looked a little bit more like mom. But it seemed to make a really big difference with that relationship building and just opening up conversations so I could learn even more about my students.
Well, I think, Sarah, that's a great point in what Dr. Banlow was just saying about showing you care. Knowing their names on the first day before you've even met them has to be very impressive to a student.
One thing that I am able to do with my students, because I teach at a small college, there aren't a lot of students there, and I have a lot of student athletes. I make it a point to go to see them doing things that they love. So I've been to basketball games and lacrosse games and soccer games, and showing them that I'm thinking about them, not just during our class time together. They know I have office hours, but they also know ways that they can get in touch with me. It was really hard yesterday when we were told that I'm not going to see them in person again until April 14th. I actually found a couple that still hadn't left yet, so we all had lunch together, just to let them know that I do care about their whole person and not just what they're, how they're performing in the classroom. And I know that's easier for me to do because my college is so small. I know it's harder when you have 70 students in one class. I don't have that, but I'm very grateful that I'm able to do that, because it has gone a long way with the level of respect that we have for one another. And I'm very thankful for that.
Those are great examples. Brian, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, and I think Penelope just wrote something, ask, don't assume. So I started this year in a new school district. And when I arrived at a big administrative meeting, we were discussing our instrumental band person who wanted to no longer be known as Mrs. She had changed her title to Mix. And they started to put all of these plans in place on how they were going to address this as a district. And because she worked in multiple buildings, having meetings with students, sending letters to families, and, being new, I sat there for a few minutes and finally raised my hand and I said, has anybody talked to them yet? Because that's actually the correct pronoun is. And no one had spoken to them yet. So after speaking with the person, what we found out is nothing big was expected. Like for elementary students, like it's all in how you present it. So if you don't make a big deal out of it, like the kids are not going to make a big deal out of it. There was no letter sent. There was no large meeting. The staff member came back and resumed teaching courses and classes and band lessons. And there were no questions within the community. So I think going back to what Penelope had said is ask people rather than making assumptions is huge, because you could do a lot of things that you think you're doing to support them. But without asking, you can't be sure.
Well, and I think that is an important component when you're talking about LGBT conversations, but also in accessibility issues. So I had a student provide me with an accommodations letter, and I was teaching a group dynamics course where the tests were in groups. So I wanted to be able to accommodate her need for additional time to take tests. So I contacted the disabilities office and I said, help me navigate this. She can take the test on her own separately in a private room with more time, but then she won't be with her team. It may be more difficult. How do we create that fairness? And the director of disability services said, did you ask her? And I said, oh, no, I didn't do that yet. I really was wanting to abide by the policy. I didn't want to make the student, she said, just ask. Maybe the student is perfectly comfortable with the group dynamic piece. And so it worked out really well, but that was an epiphany for me to step back and say, oh my goodness, the first thing that really we should do is ask.
Well, when there's a different, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mark. I think that the challenge you have is that that society has said, oh, let's be repressive. Let's not deal with this issue, or let's over deal with the issue. And instead just having good common sense and good human ethics about, let's just talk to someone and ask how they're feeling. If as leaders, if we don't really look at the big picture, we get tied into the minutia. And so my thinking is, as you're trying to build community, think about that individual person in the community, and whether that's a child, whether that's a parent or a grandmother and an uncle or a staff member, everybody has a different lens, and everybody's reaction to that is different. So you've got to treat it as an individual level. That's just my personal experience to share.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I was a school counselor before I became an administrator, and I still have a private practice working with married couples. And one of the big aspects of working with anybody is getting them to share who they are and being able to have them identify their needs. Again, going back to my statement about honor, it's about who a person is. And by asking them, that's the greatest way, because you're not defining it anymore. They're defining what their needs are. And by putting that in place, and you can go all the way down to pre-K and be able to get them to be able to identify who they are. And it may be a simplistic language, but at the same time, it's them having a stance in their own lives. I had a professor and actually a teacher say the same thing to me, was like, it's your life, take part in it. So we can teach that so early that it's theirs to be able to honor. And I think that's an important aspect.
Absolutely.
And I think it's a both and, right? I mentioned this in the chat box, but there is the care of the individual and the individual experiences, but it's also that care of the institution, right? And I think it pertains back to what we talked about with policy, that it's always that exchange between those two placements, that you of course are meeting people where they're at, but you're also cognizant of whatever state, local, federal, particular policies or regulations you also have. So it's incredibly complicated work we're all in, right? But it's always that we're zooming in and zooming out, no pun intended, with that focus as to meet the challenges and to meet those accommodations, whatever they might be.
So true. Any comments from the chat, Kate, that you want to address or bring to everyone's attention?
There's a lot of good discussion happening in the chat. One thing that was pointed out that I don't know that anyone spoke about was the use of restorative practices, and the way that it can help build community. Certainly a strong research base there. Some folks from Allentown are sharing that they're dipping into that, and having that structure of creating community and having community meetings on a regular basis allows you then, when something destructive to the community does happen or something stressful happens, you have this structure in place to be able to come together and talk about it. And then there's a lot of folks talking about the importance of helping with self-advocacy and really going to the individual. And Abby mentioned that sometimes it's easier for children to speak their needs than it is for adults to.
That's very true. So I want to take the next two together. Just Dr. Smith had mentioned earlier, looking at having various perspectives. And I think too, Darlene talked about math and calculus and some of those pieces. And I think it's really important to look at how we choose our course content and how we respond to student identities within that. And for Sarah and Lynn, who are reading our textbook, there was two examples of an economics professor who wanted someone to look at immigration policy from an economic standpoint. And what was happening within the class discussion is a lot of other issues were coming into place. The student identities, where the content was written and where it came from. So I think it's really important to think about how we choose that course content. And the research we do, now some of you I know in K-12 environment may be limited to what you're allowed to select, but from a higher ed perspective, we often do select our own authors and textbooks and articles that we have to be aware of all of the background and where it had come from. I had a textbook, I taught a intercultural community course, and the textbook actually talked about race as a biological process. And I had to go to the program director and say, I don't want to use this textbook. We need to, and I had to make students aware, and I offered to them as undergraduate students to disagree with the textbook. Does anybody have any comments about that related to choosing course content or responding to student identities within it?
That's something I've definitely done a lot of at the undergraduate level. One of the things I like to do is use journal articles to supplement readings, and I will put a picture of the author with the title page so that students can visually see the diversity in the authors and who's out there. And particularly when I was teaching more diverse classrooms, I felt that this was really important. I have a soft spot in my heart for philosophy and for some of the founders of psychology in particular and what they did, and they're wonderful and they're great ideas, but there are ideas out there from other people who look and lived very differently, and their voices weren't always heard because of issues of privilege and issues of oppression. So that's kind of been opened to me, and I try to invite those voices in more, and I find the students really appreciate that.
Absolutely, that's great advice. Anybody else want to make a comment here?
I'm curious for our folks out west in the more conservative states, if there's any conversations around blocking content on the internet. Because I'm just thinking about in Pennsylvania, there used to be conversations about what books weren't allowed in libraries, like the Canterbury Tales possibly because of some of the dirty nature in the book. So I'm curious if our folks out west have similar conversations today, because I don't think they really occur anymore in Pennsylvania, do they?
Oh, they occur in Wyoming. I promise. So it's interesting. I teach literature and writing, and I feel a certain sense of responsibility to provide experiences that are not. We're a very homogeneous group of people, with the exception of American Indians. We are a border community. We deal a lot with the suppression of those voices. I also oversee the libraries. And we actually have a library that has been overstocked with a very specific kind of religious perspective. And my library director is working very hard to rectify that situation. And it becomes, for her, almost daily a personnel issue. She has a librarian trying to adopt books in this one genre. And she has community support for that because we're so homogeneous.
Thanks, Sarah, for sharing. Anybody else have a comment or a question for each other?
I will say that I collaborate a lot with my librarian. She's wonderful, but we're constantly looking for making sure that our kiddos have access to books with characters and protagonists who look like them and represent all races, religions, ability levels. And we're in constant conversation about what other books she wants to, how she wants to use her budget money and what else we can put in our library to make it more inclusive. And I think that's really important. And it speaks to the nature of collaboration and what we're doing.
Very true. Great. Thank you. So we only have a few minutes left. So I'm going to go through these relatively quickly, but if there is something that everybody or anyone wants to share, please obviously jump in. But the idea of setting the tone and having expectations. So what students expect during their class time, like Amanda talked about that morning meeting, sitting in the circle, what will they need to do? What do they need to prepare? I always tried with undergraduate students to let them know that they had to do the reading and the prep, because the class was actually going to be all activity, all engagement, and all discussion, that they had to come in already knowing. And I think that's a different expectation, especially for an undergraduate student that expects to sit in the back with their hat on and their headphones in and not have to engage. So the idea of how we define success, and that comes back to the course content and the identity development for students. And the idea of transparent teaching, I think, is really important for our students to understand the why. Darlene, I'm sure teaching math, you probably have heard it more than once that calculus does, the students don't need calculus in the real world. And I always tell my undergrads or students that I worked with, I use calculus I solve for X almost every day. Some of it might have a lot to do with the fact that I speed on the highway, and I'm always doing the rate time versus distance so that the officer doesn't pull me over. Any comments related to any of those? This is a quote by George Q, who is a student development or student engagement expert in higher education. And I think it goes without saying, but I'm going to say it, students cannot engage themselves, right? We're really, when we talk about leadership, it's important for us to connect with the students and do all of these things. It takes a lot of work to build community and create a welcoming environment. So some of these strategies I wanted to talk about are the awareness of our own assumptions. And I think many of you mentioned that idea today. We talked a little bit about course content and getting to know students. And planning, right? We have to look at how we accommodate students, how we take attendance, what we do with grading, our instructional strategies, and how we handle controversial topics. I think that's a really important component related to this idea. I am not someone who tries to avoid controversial topics. I like to discuss them in the classroom, but I think many of you talked about how we define safety and taking risk, and I think that is on my next slide, so I want to get to that. Make uncertainty safe. And this comes from our author of our textbook, How Learning Works, but the idea of validating different viewpoints, even unpopular ones. And I think for me, this happens, I was teaching multicultural communication during the 2016 election. And that was a real challenge for undergraduate students where the conservative students felt like their viewpoint was extremely unpopular and they didn't want to share. Embracing the complexity of our viewpoints rather than oversimplifying them. And I think, Darlene, you talked about this with math. Resist a single right answer. Ask students to generate multiple approaches. So this is what Darlene shared with us several minutes ago. Any of these 3 points have anything you want to add? You know, we're almost out of time. So I just want to offer again some things that here are some references and resources. I also like to recommend James Lang's book, Small Teaching, helps to look at how we create that welcoming environment. Anybody have a key takeaway for us today in our last 2 minutes together? Kate, anything that's happening in the chat that you want to touch base?
Mostly just conversation about dealing with controversial topics, but Dr. Widener certainly shares a takeaway is just tolerance and acceptance. Lucy shares, not making assumptions. And I think, it's interesting, we have people who have higher ed concentrations here, special ed, people who teach first grade, people who teach college. So I want to commend you for putting together a presentation that is relevant no matter what age the students are. We have a lot more in common across K-12 and higher ed than it often seems that we do.
So interesting, Darlene just mentioned, I've actually, now that I'm not sharing, I can read the chat, so I'm excited to be part of it. But the idea of the former felons who are now part of our academic environment. There's a lot of information and conversation happening about that. Anything, Darlene, you want to add to that?
Sure. We have a very special student at our institution who was incarcerated for a period of 5.5 years for doing a home invasion. Unfortunately, you know the story, they get involved with the wrong group, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Unfortunately, in the prison systems in Delaware, they were not allowed to take online classes because they can't use computers. So he actually did an old correspondence course, yeah, in that old school, from Ohio State, and realized he liked learning. So then when he was in, and I don't know the correct term, like the halfway house, he still could not attend school. He had to work at Panera Bread. He finally got to home with just an ankle bracelet and had to track all of his movements. Well, in the state of Delaware, we were the only institution that would allow him to attend. And I think that's a horrible statement on higher ed, because a felon is not always a felon. And we took this young man in and we gave him the ability to learn, to move forward. We try to embrace all students, and we pride ourselves on that. He was able to join Phi Theta Kappa, which is the National Honor Society for two-year colleges. He became the president for our region, and then on his campaign to become international president, he wrote on labels and felons and how those labels distract people from being successful. And how can you put these former convicts out onto the streets without giving them the skills to succeed? Because if you don't, they're going to be right back where they are. And he is now international president for Phi Theta Kappa. So what a wonderful story for a tremendous young man. And by the way, he was just accepted to Columbia University.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that's a really powerful way to end our conversation. And again, able to see the chat now, looking at that asking versus assumption, listening rather than speaking. I think Shelby said, learned a lot from listening. And I think that's really important for all of us to be aware that we often learn more when we aren't talking. All right, so Kate just posted the link to the next session.
Should we take 5?
Is that okay with everybody? All right, I want to thank everyone for coming along, like I said, on my Zoom journey with me. And I wish if you could all look at how amazing it is the Brady Bunch gone berserk. So I'll post photos and share them with everyone. You can see how it looks. So thank you, everybody. Have a great next session. Thank you.
Thank you.